policy moves fast, providers need clarity. That's why we go above the noise.
Hey, folks, good day and welcome to the inaugural episode of the Above the Noise podcast. My name is Ed Marasco, and I'll be hosting this edition of Above the Noise. MTN is one component of the larger, broader Ames On Air podcast series. We understand that policies, particularly governmental policies, move fast and providers need clarity. That's why we go above the noise to provide important industry updates and insights for those who are part of the critical care transport community. So with that brief introduction, let's jump right in. I'd like to introduce you to our guests today. And let's start with myself. I have the privilege of serving as the vice chair of the Ames Government Affairs Committee, along with Chris Hall, who's our chair, and a variety of people from organizations across the country who represent government affairs work for their particular organizations. As a result of my being the vice chair and my inability to say no to Jana Williams, who's the president and CEO of Ames, I'll be serving as your host for this particular podcast. Our featured guests are members of the team from Thorn Run Partners. And if you're not familiar with Thorn Run has been Ames government relations partner since 2023. I'm joined today by Shea McCarthy and Kyle Sanders. Both are partners at Thorn Run. Kyle brings decades of public service experience to Thorn Run that includes his most recent assignment prior to joining Thorn Run as a senior aide and deputy chief of staff to Senator Thom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina who serves as a member of Senate Finance, Banking, Judiciary, and Veterans Affairs Committee. So Kyle is tightly wired in and has a ton of experience. Kyle, tell us a little bit more about your experience and background and your role as a part of the Ames team.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. I'll try not to. You got to be careful letting a lawyer talk about themselves, but I'll try not to be too long-winded here. I started out on this quest. I was a low-level prosecutor in my hometown, and wasn't really interested in policy, frankly, but got to see the end result of how policy is shaped as a young prosecutor, and thought to myself, "Gee, wouldn't that be cool to shape some of that policy on the front end?" And I was fortunate enough to have a mentor and the district attorney who let me come up to Washington, do some networking and shake some hands. And fast forward, I was able to land a job on the Hill as an unpaid intern. Back when they did those, they did not pay those for those roles. Uh, Worked for several different appropriators, so members of the Appropriations Committee on the House side. I was fortunate enough to work for my home district, home state Congressman Rouser, before joining Senator Thom Tillis's office and doing a lot of odd jobs for the senator. When you become deputy chief, you pretty much just do what he says. But I was able to help stakeholders in North Carolina in that role navigate the federal government. And that gave me a lot of expertise and experience in helping clients, my day job now, helping them navigate the federal government. So it's been a great partnership with Ames, and excited to continue doing a lot of good work.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks very much for that update. Shea McCarthy is the second member of our team, and Shea's a respected lobbyist, health policy analyst, and communications expert representing some of Washington's most influential stakeholders. He's the lead coordinator for Thorn Run's multidisciplinary policy team, and Mr. McCarthy also advises clients on the intricacies of healthcare policy. And gosh, we've had a lot of these conversations over the last couple of years, particularly as it relates to the NSA. Shea, tell us a little bit more about your background and your role as a part of the Ames team.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Ed. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., where I was born and bred. And so kind of that proximity to the U.S. Capitol was my entryway into politics. And while it can, I get the sense, feel a little bit mysterious to people on the outside, I actually went to high school at a place called Gonzaga. It was the closest high school in the country to the U.S. Capitol. I had a couple classmates who had parents who were elected officials and lobbyists, and it made this entire kind of world of policy and politics feel approachable to me. So I had started up doing speech and debate and getting my feet wet on public policy. I ended up studying economics in undergrad, which really laid the groundwork for a future in policy. And then working across a variety of campaigns, entry-level position on Capitol Hill, I eventually found myself at Thorn Run Partners. And at the time, it was just an upstart lobbying firm. I was the first entry-level employee at Thorn Run over 15 years ago. As I mentioned, there was just four of us. I have seen Thorn Run grow over the last 15 years and change to now be over 60 people strong, to be a top 10 firm in Washington. And I've been lucky to be a big part of that growth and to see what this is all about. And so having talented people like Kyle, who have joined our team over the last couple of years, has been one of the great privileges of watching a firm like Thorn Run grow. But what we're all about is bipartisanship, representing our clients on both sides of the aisle, and being fair and effective arbiters when it comes to being their liaisons to Capitol Hill and being the voices of industry. So we feel very fortunate to be playing that role on behalf of Ames, and am really grateful to be part of this kickoff podcast here, Ed.
Fantastic. So it would be safe to say this is in your blood, my friend.
That's exactly right.
So some member of the audience may not know this, but Shea is a proud Notre Dame alumni, and we talk about that often. Shea, what years were you actually on campus?
Well, for some people in our audience, maybe it works best to think in terms of, football. I know that's how I probably best remember some of my years. So I think of it as being there from like the Brady Quinn era to the Jimmy Clausen era. Technically, that was 2006 to 2010. But I had a great experience on campus. And, a Notre Dame person does not go long without making sure you know where they went to college, and so I appreciate you bringing that up, Ed. One of my favorite topics of conversation.
Yeah, actually, absolutely. And my youngest went there, and we talk about it often. And obviously, for anybody who's associated with the Notre Dame family, is a sad couple of weeks with the passing of Coach Holtz. I saw some video of the celebration of his life earlier this week or late last week, which was tremendous.
Yeah, and I was brainwashed at a young age to go to Notre Dame. My dad was a Notre Dame alumni himself, and I was 5 years old in 1993 when he brought me out for the first time, and Lou Holtz was the coach. And there's a famous quote that's always resonated with me, and he said something to the effect of, "For those that know Notre Dame, no explanation is necessary, and for those who don't, no explanation will suffice." And that really kind of speaks to the legacy, the kind of the magic that you feel on campus. And there's a camaraderie there. And any away fan, I think, could testify to the same, because Notre Dame's home fans will make you feel at home during your day on campus if you ever make it out to South Bend.
Yeah, absolutely. I've had the opportunity. So, Kyle, we will talk college sports with you, but you had a pretty big milestone this last year in your life with little one number two. How are things going with having two little ones at home these days?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ed. It's a constant challenge. I've got two children under three, right?
Ooh,
And my wife too has a high-powered career and is pulled in different directions with travel. She's in Richmond as we speak. So getting out the door in the morning with two little ones in time for a meeting with a congressman at 9 a.m. is a challenge that I was fortunate enough to overcome today. But it comes with the territory a little bit. Uh,
yeah,
Lucky that everybody's healthy and the fits aren't too extended at this point. But it definitely, one thing I wrestle with as a professional is I want to be the best at everything I touch. I want to be the best dad, spouse, and certainly professional possible. And to give 110% in all three of those avenues is challenging.
yeah.
But it's something that I'm committed to and will continue to try and fail at. But I think that end product is still a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys very much for sharing some of that. I think it's always great for our listeners to know who they're talking to, a little bit about the people. With that, let's jump right in, and we've tried to set this up in segments for our listeners and watchers. So the first segment we're going to cover each and every time we're together with you is what's happening in DC. So let's start and take a little bit of time to explore some of the current trends and highlights from what's happening in Washington. And just as a side note, this is what we do in the weekly government affairs call with the Government Affairs Committee. Our friends from Thorn Run give us an update of sort of what's happening this week. So let's jump right in. What's fun and what's not these days on the Hill and in and around Washington?
Yeah, Ed, I'm happy to jump in on that. You know, let me set the context here. We're in an election year, which means that everything that every member of Congress votes on, everything that leadership determines whether it's going to be on the House or Senate floor, is really in the context of the election. And so, very often, the first year after kind of getting into office after an election is the action year. And the year of the elections is very much positioning and jockeying for position. And we're kind of seeing that play out. I would say that the expectations for a whole lot of proactive legislating are relatively limited in 2026, at least between now and the election. There are a couple must pass vehicles in Washington, and folks like me and Kyle pay close attention to the things that have to move because we look at those as your vehicles. Every year, congressional spending or appropriations bills are going to go through a National Defense Authorization Act. Healthcare extenders are likely to get extended. We're going to see some of those come up later this year. We look at those vehicles or those must pass items as the opportunities that we're oftentimes looking at when figuring out what the path forward is for our pieces of legislation. And in an election year, those deadlines are relatively limited. And certainly, like the bipartisan conversations, start to get a little bit watered down. Folks are retreating to their respective corners and they're poll testing every single bill that comes up to determine whether or not it's going to help them in November. And then on top of that, you also have the Iran war that I think has taken a lot of attention. It's injected just another level of political polarization into Washington. What I will say, and I'm just not going to go too far down that rabbit hole, but what I don't want to lose sight of, because I've really highlighted a little bit of the partisan environment, that's what plays out in the headlines. That's what does well on cable news. Members of Congress that are in Washington, though, they are committed to wanting to deliver results. And a lot of the work that happens in committees of jurisdiction, that happens behind the scenes, that is so boring that it does not even make C-SPAN, that's the stuff where bipartisan negotiations, finding areas for compromise, and those kumbaya moments do really play out. Despite the fact that we're maybe living in the most partisan environment ever, the vast majority of legislation that passes needs to have votes from both Republicans and Democrats. And so, that's the environment that we're working in as well. We have to keep all those in mind as we prioritize what our clients are trying to get across the finish line and really determine the art of the possible in Washington.
Yeah, it seems like, just as you said, Shay, it seems like on the surface, everything that's politicized is very partisan. But we know we found some common ground on some things, and so it's interesting. You talk about that as sort of something that happens more quietly. Any sense about what people are thinking about in terms of legislative activity moving forward? Is this going to be stuff after the war sort of gets into the next phase, or are you getting the sense that there's activity happening now and will continue to happen in the weeks and months ahead?
Kyle, I'm interested for your take. My sense
Yeah.
is that the White House is likely to ask for somewhere between $50 billion and $100 billion of additional funding from Congress to help finance these ongoing military activities, which they're, I think, at least for now, be careful not to dub a war. Um, but with that in mind, it's an uphill battle. Democrats are probably going to be very reluctant to deliver those votes, and for every fiscal hawk that you have in the Republican Party, there is a defense hawk too. And so you've got folks on one hand that are supportive of the interventions. And then on the other hand, if the administration's asking for $50 billion, you've got some of these fiscal conservatives saying, where's the offset? Where are we going to find the money for all that? It's going to make it very hard for Congress ultimately to authorize this funding. They may look at some arcane avenues like the so-called reconciliation process. They can bypass the need for negotiating with Democrats effectively by using the reconciliation process. It's the way to work around the filibuster. But you need to keep Republicans really closely aligned, and that means satisfying both the defense hawks and the fiscal hawks at the same time. It's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll just add, Ed, I think one important piece of context for our viewers is that the margins. So if you zoom out a little bit, it's right to conclude that Republicans have control of the White House, of the House of Representatives, and the Senate. So all three uh, chambers, if you will. But the margins of control are very narrow in both the House and Senate. So in order to move, even when you have united, quote unquote, united front of Republican control, moving any piece of legislation through the House, which has got a margin of 2 or 3 that they can lose, and the Senate with a similar margin, is a challenging exercise because you have different ideologues within the Republican conference that are going to feel differently. And the fiscal hawk versus defense hawk is a good example that Shea used. So while it may seem like whatever the topic is, topic du jour, a good idea on paper, there's probably going to be a challenge ahead to get consensus, even in just the Republican Party, let alone folding in Democrats. So I think the Iran conflict right now is a bit of an elephant in the room in terms of what could demand attention from Congress. In terms of activity underway, there are committees and subcommittees doing the work that is necessary to build a bill. For instance, the appropriations subcommittees are having budgetary hearings this week as we speak. They're receiving input from members and stakeholders on what priorities Congress should emphasize and fund. That's a months-long process that plays out pretty quietly, as Shea alluded. It's not sexy. It's not going to grab headlines, but it is sort of that bipartisan necessary work that has to take place to build a larger bill. So that's not being bogged down by some of these larger issues, but there will come a time where there's a bit of a crossroads on what can Congress and what should Congress prioritize. And a lot of that direction is going to come from the White House. If we see this conflict extend for weeks and then even months, if you're having issues with the Strait of Hormuz still not processing oil exports, then affordability becomes a real issue that the administration has already highlighted and is trying its best to address. But that affordability piece is a battle cry for both parties right now, heading into a 2020 midterm cycle. And it's something that we're going to hear even more of as the airwaves begin being flooded with these political ads.
Yeah. Well, Dennis, thank you very much both for that insight in terms of what's happening. Well, let's move forward. The next segment that we had planned for today, and as a regular part of our offering, is sort of a government affairs 101 segment. And so, I wanted to pick your brains a little bit about a topic that we discuss fairly regularly on the weekly calls, and something that folks may not really understand or appreciate. But recently, we had a community fly-in in DC. Can you tell the audience a little bit about what that means, and why it's important?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack at this. So a fly-in is, we dub pretty much the first quarter of every year as fly-in season. As a former staffer myself, that's when you can expect organizations, trade associations, community college groups, healthcare advocates, transportation infrastructure advocates, you name it, everything under the sun has a group or a lobbyist or a trade association. And during that first quarter tends to be when you see an influx of visitors. So we dub that fly-in season a fly-in for our purposes and to educate the folks that may not be aware. We have members within Ames that are not exposed necessarily to the government affairs side of the coin, if you will, who get an opportunity to come travel to DC and meet with
Right.
members of the House, members of Congress, members of the Senate, members of the administration. And what we do in those meetings is a lot of different things, but part of our exercise is to really elevate and educate folks on our priorities. So any given group is going to be advocating on behalf of whether that's legislative changes that they'd like to see uh, that would benefit the group. If there is existing legislation out there that's a threat to the group, this fly-in is a good opportunity to raise awareness to lawmakers about some of those nuances. Uh, it, you know, for Shea and I, we spend every week up on the Hill or in the administration meeting with members, senators, staff, always. It, the message received from a stakeholder, a constituent, a voter carries a lot more weight than it does from, they obviously love to hear from us. They know us. We're a known entity. But to really drive home a point, it's critical that you have some input and participation from your members and namely constituents, because at the end of the day, these members were elected by constituents and they want to fulfill the directive of those constituents to the best of their ability. So we really use it as an opportunity to harness our membership and help echo some of the concerns that we have identified as priorities, concerns, threats for AIMS and our members.
Yeah, well said, Kyle. And Ed, I think one thing we can do during this segment is maybe demystify the process of lobbying a little bit. I think that, what we do can seem like it's a lot of handshake deals in smoke-filled rooms, and that may be an element of old school lobbying. But I look at it a little bit differently, what we do and the value that we add to an organization like AIMS. Kyle kind of alluded to this in his comments when he said everyone has a trade association. And I think that's a good way to think about it, because even people that may have a certain notion about lobbyists, it's transactional, or you're, greasing politicians to get your things across the finish line. The truth is, everyone has a lobbyist. And, whether you're someone listening to this podcast who has a lobbyist and us representing AIMS, whether your spouse is a teacher who's represented by the teachers union, whether your parents who are senior citizens are represented by AARP and groups like that are advocating for the interest and well-being of teachers. And there's just so many examples of that. It's folks like us that kind of help figure out how to navigate Washington and how to pull the levers of influence. And so those fly-ins are when we kind of bring that to bear. We help develop the strategy for who are the right offices to meet with. And Kyle and I are wise enough to know that we're not always the best messenger, which is why having people that are those constituents, people that are personally affected by these issues, are the ones to ultimately make the sale. The same way that a lawyer might help their client navigate the intricacies of having to deal with the legal system, a lobbyist helps their client, whoever that might be, navigate the intricacies of the federal government. And those fly-ins are kind of action in practice, and really a preeminent demonstration of what we're doing delivered.
Yeah, thanks for that insight. And for me, and you guys do a wonderful job on our behalf, sort of guiding us and helping us understand, uh, what our responsibility is, what our role is during a fly-in. And I think for me, one of the aha moments a number of years ago when I started doing this regularly is that the folks there on the Hill are looking for information, right? So we become educators. Our job is to educate the people, the staff in the offices, about the issues that affect, well, like you said, if it's teachers or AARP, or in our case, critical care transport, right? They don't necessarily know about our world and what we do. And so flying gives us an opportunity to connect with the people who are in positions of influence there in DC or wherever, at your state capital, wherever you happen to be, and do that. So, and we appreciate the guidance, because you're right. It's a mystical world in a lot of ways to those of us who are in the transport industry. Well, I appreciate that. This is a great segue into our feature segment for this episode, which is the newly coined Air Medical Caucus. There has been a great deal of focus over the last few months and on bringing the Air Medical Caucus online. This is an area that I and members of the audience may not completely understand, and so I wonder if I could engage you guys to give us a little bit more insight. Kyle, maybe let's start with the basics. What is the caucus and why is it important?
Good question, and there are a lot of ways to answer it. But the simplest way to think about a congressional caucus is it's a forum or a vehicle for a particular topic. So, for our purposes, the Air Medical Caucus was just incorporated by Congressman Ryan Zinke and Jill Takuda. Congressman Zinke of Montana, Takuda of Hawaii. They both have particularly unique districts that are rural in nature and have their own complications, where they have an inherent interest in appreciation for what we do for air medical transport and the necessity that it is. So they were obvious champions to us, but even that took some cultivating. So I'll take a step back. But there are multiple, there are numerous congressional caucuses in both the House and Senate, and uh, ideally you'll have it's a bipartisan coalition essentially of members of Congress that convene to discuss issues important to the caucus. So for us, issues that are important to the air medical transport industry, right? Uh, we're hopeful that we now have our co-leads, right, that I just mentioned, but building out that bench of co-sponsors will be some of the work that we do in the coming months, getting other rural members, again, in a nonpartisan or bipartisan fashion, joining Republicans and Democrats who share a passion for ensuring that rural Americans, but really all Americans, have access to this critical service. And it's a venue to have conversations about things that are going well in the industry, things that Congress could be doing better to make the industry function a little bit better, or regulations that might be tripping us up a bit. It's a good venue to highlight some of those things. And potentially what can be born out of that are new policy ideas, but certainly elevating our issues to across multiple demographics, states, districts in a way that is much more challenging on an ad hoc basis. So it is this convening forum for just issues we care about. And we're lucky to have champions there already, but it's also a bit of I don't want to say bench in a negative way, but it's a bench of members and supporters and champions that we can call on when we need to.
Yeah. And so was there something in particular right now that caused the association and with your advice to decide to activate the Air Medical Caucus now at this time?
It was just a long time coming. The caucus actually existed about a decade ago and went defunct and had not been incorporated for quite some time, and it's just a missed opportunity. And I think our Ames leadership identified that as something that we should put energy behind. And we were fortunate enough, again, Jan has got her leadership in mind, wanted to see this thing take flight, so to speak. And that was our directive. It's easy to find because we do have so many natural champions that we've worked with over the years, whether it's on veterans issues or reimbursement issues. So we had a good crop to choose from, and we'll have, I think, a relatively easy time building that bench of support out.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Super.
Kyle, I would add to that. I think that the stakes have only been increasing when it comes to the federal government's imprint on our industry and on the need to have an elevated presence with members of Congress. I think that the major VA reimbursement issue over the last several years, I think, served as a wake-up call to a lot of members of Congress. We've been talking about things like Medicare reimbursement lagging behind costs for a long time. But seeing the VA potentially adopting Medicare's poor payment rates and the impact that could have had, while our members are also juggling things like implementing the No Surprises Act, a whole new playing field in their negotiations with insurers, a shifting landscape on private insurance that's really being cultivated by changes in federal policy, our need to have an active presence, regardless of whether any individual bill is moving, but to have this organized coalition of members that could be a venue to elevate these issues and allow for a way for members of Congress to self-identify that they want to be looking out for the air ambulance industry. It's just been a nice symbiosis because we hear all of these issues from our members around the country in months and months of relaying them to members of Congress. They've really bought into the idea that having this sort of organized structure to tackle the myriad of issues, because we're not just working on one bill, we're working on many, is the best way to kind of help get our message out and to elevate the needs of the air ambulance industry.
Thank you. Thank you for your insight. Any other closing thoughts from either of you relative to the Air Medical Caucus and what's next for us?
I'm just glad I've got Shea here to help clean up the mess when I forget stuff.
Oh,
Yeah.
come on now.
And Ed, what I'll just say in closing, and this is sort of caucus aside, what Kyle and I do are provide 52 weeks a year of representation. And whether it's coffees, lunches, happy hours, we try to keep these relationships warm. But the impact that we have is just so severely amplified by everything that our members are able to kind of feed into government affairs and the contributions that they make. And it looks like a variety of things, Ed. We've got a very active government affairs committee for people that are staying especially close to these issues and providing week-to-week contributions. We've got some members that don't necessarily have the resources to be engaging every week, but they do things like participate in grassroots campaigns. They come to the annual conference. They respond to data requests that Ames has. Every single one of our members, even just by supporting Ames from a membership perspective, is helping the impact that we're trying to have in Washington. And so we can be that day-to-day liaison to Capitol Hill, but our job at the end of the day is really to amplify the concerns and the voice of the industry, and it's really a privilege to be able to do that.
Yeah, and thank you very much, gentlemen, for also acknowledging the members and all the work that gets done. Because you're right, that's really where the rubber meets the road. And you guys provide tremendous roadmap, and I think each member in their own way has an opportunity to contribute to the government affairs effort for sure. Well, it's been a pleasure to have both Shea and Kyle on this episode. I can't thank you both enough for taking the time out of your schedule to join us and share such meaningful insight. Any other closing thoughts on any topic either of you want to share?
I want to tune into the next Ed Marasco show because you're the one that's got all the historical context and knowledge base, Ed. So that's what I want to learn from.
I appreciate that. And by the way, I did not pay Kyle to say that, just so everybody's aware. Uh, well, thank you very much to our audience for joining us for this inaugural episode of Above the Noise. We're excited to be able to bring you some of the latest insights from the government affairs team at Ames and among the membership. As the gentlemen both pointed out, it's a very active committee. Please join us for our next episode of Above the Noise. Well, we're going to examine some of the key conversations that took place at the recent Ames Government Relations Strategic Planning meeting, occurred in D.C. in concert with the fly-in that we were just talking about, and some of the specific initiatives the community will be pursuing moving forward. Again, thanks very much for tuning in. We greatly appreciate it, and we hope you found this time valuable.
Thanks for listening to Ames on Air. Today's Above the Noise panel highlighted current issues across air medical and critical care ground transport. Policy moves fast, providers need clarity. That's why we go above the noise. Subscribe in your podcast app and visit the Ames on Air page at aams.org for show notes and links. See you next time.